of Washington's farewell address and the whole idea of the emergence or the development of the American party system. But before we do that, I'd like to turn and ask you to think for a minute about the current campaign for the party nominations for President of the United States in this 2016 fall election season. This past weekend, we had an opportunity to witness debates in both major parties. On Friday night, there was a one-on-one debate between the two Democratic candidates, Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. Missing, of course, was Governor O'Malley, who dropped out prior to this particular debate. Governor O'Malley never really got any legs under his campaign. He never really attracted a significant portion of the Democratic electorate at all. But one of the things his exodus did was to make possible a traditional one-on-one exchange between the two candidates left running. I posted on Facebook on Saturday, I believe, that I believe that the debate Friday evening between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders was probably the best one-on-one debate that I've ever seen, political debate that I've ever seen. I think the pundits agree with me. Whether they be conservative, whether they be liberal, whether they be Democratic leaners, whether they be leaning towards the Republican side. Those who witnessed that debate seemed almost unanimous in the quality of the debate itself. The accolades on Chuck Todd and Rachel Maddow as moderators were unending. Ultimately, they did a fantastic job. And the evidence of that is that they weren't that visible throughout the entire evening. They kept the discussion on track. They kept the candidates focused. They kept the process moving. But at the same time, they did it in ways which was not overbearing. It was not the kind of performance by the moderators that made them actual players or participants in the process. In other words, if you've ever been exposed to workplace training, high-class workplace training, you know the importance of the role of the facilitator. And there's kind of an abstract ideal of what it takes to be a good facilitator. And Rachel Maddow and Chuck Todd met that ideal. One of the things that they were able to do that none of the other debates has been able to do thus far is follow up elements of discussion with the appropriate follow-through questions. Asking the kinds of follow-up questions that took the debate deeper and deeper and deeper into the issues. There's absolutely no question. I remarked on an item that I put on Facebook on Saturday, the back and forth discussion between the two candidates on the issue of big money in politics, the influence of Wall Street, the influence of Hillary Clinton's speaking engagements for major Wall Street firms like Goldman Sachs, and the amount of money that she was collecting for these appearances, and the potential impact that had or might have on the political results following those particular contributions was probably the deepest and best exchange that I've ever seen on that particular issue. There's not too much more to be added, it seems to me, to what those two candidates were able to put on the table during the course of that discussion. It was superb. On Saturday night, we had the latest in a series of Republican debates. And while the Republican field becomes smaller and smaller as one candidate after the other is withdrawing. We had Rick Santorum withdraw. We had Rand Paul withdraw for reasons that ABC may be able to explain, but nobody else can. Carly Fiorina was left off the agenda, was left off the stage in Saturday night's Republican debate. And in fact, her campaign took out a very negative ad towards ABC. For the decision to exclude one of the participants. And actually, in the previous debates, Carly Fiorina had actually garnered a larger percentage of support than did some of the people who were on stage. One of the major players in Saturday night's Republican debate was Chris Christie, governor of New Jersey. Fact of the matter is, in recent polls, Carly Fiorina was outpolling him. So if one of them was not going to be allowed to participate prior to the debate, it should have been Chris Christie rather than Carly Fiorina. So just in terms of the numbers. So it seems to me that ABC has some explaining to do, but that disturbed me before the debate happened. But there's no question that once the debate happens, if you were privileged to see it and hear it, you probably recognize that it was one of the better debates on the Republican side as well. I don't think it came close to the quality of the Democratic debate the night before. But it was good and it was informative. And to be very honest with you, these debates, especially the Republican debates, make for really good television. I think they're, the big thing going now is so-called reality TV. And these debates are classic examples of reality TV. We are witnessing our political process unfold right before our eyes, and it's fascinating, it seems to me. But the fact of the matter is, as the field gets smaller, the debates get better. And the fact of the matter is, when the field gets down to 2, the Democratic debate suggests that that's the makings of the ideal political debate. Fact of the matter is, the major difference between the two debates that I saw was that the Democratic debate focused on issues, whereas the Republican debate continued to focus on personalities. And that stands to reason, given the fact that there were so many different competing personalities on stage. And so it's very obvious, with that many competitors, then each one must concentrate and focus upon the other competitors, not the issues. You can't really afford the luxury of focusing on the issues until the field gets down to a manageable size of 3 or 4 at the most. But as long as the field continues to be 7 or 8 people, it becomes extremely difficult, it seems to me, to push personality into the background and bring political issues to the fore. But given that particular limitation, I agree that this particular debate was more informative than any of the others. At least that's my perception. And that's the perception that I chose to put on Facebook. But the issue that I put on Facebook that I think is the most significant is based on a phenomenon, on an item or an issue that I discovered during the day. And when I say I discovered it, I don't mean that nobody else knows it's there. I didn't know it was there. But in the course of my reading, I ran across an article on Salon, the political website called Salon, about a phenomenon called the deep state. I don't know how many of you have heard the term the deep state. Let me share with you the elements of the Salon article about the deep state. The Deep State is the title of a book written by Mike Lofgren, Lofgren. Mike Lofgren was a staffer, a Republican staffer, for many years in Washington. He has since that time become a very prominent author and has published articles and books over the last several years about his insights and his experience in the political process as a long-term GOP staffer. And when I say long-term, I'm talking about in excess of 25 years. This guy knows the election process. And he was an available staffer for GOP candidates for years. He is the one that came up with the idea of the so-called deep state. And let me, if I can, share with you the elements of the deep state as explained in an interview on Salon by one of Salon's political reporters, Elias Isquith, Isquith. Elias Isquith wrote this particular piece and conducted this interview with Mike Lofgren on the idea of the deep state. Briefly, let me explain what this is about. According to Lofgren, our political process, our government, has fallen to the mercy of what he calls the deep state, which is a network of wealthy elites that he argues, Lofgren argues, has hijacked our government. It is what many people think about when they think about the idea of a hidden government, of those behind the scenes who are pulling the strings and making the decisions that really affect what our government does or does not do. But Lofgren's argument is that it's not really hidden. It's, in fact, for the most part, quite visible. But the fact of the matter is, most people, for a variety of different reasons, don't notice it. In fact, the author of this piece on Salon, Elias Isquith, makes the point that, and this is a quote, people would rather know about Kim Kardashian than what makes up the budget or what the government is doing in Mali or Sudan or other unknown places. That's what you get. A disconnected, self-serving bureaucracy that basically is evolving to do whatever it chooses and feels the need to do. And that results in its own enhancement of its own power. That's the deep state. Lofgren's position is that the deep state has three components. The public component, which is public agencies and public officials. A private component, especially a financial component, which is ultimately Wall Street. And a third component, a technological component, which is Silicon Valley. And these three entities working together, meshing together, have formed almost an independent, autonomous state within the state that most of us see and know about. At this point, I'd like to pause there because we're moving towards the top of the hour. We've got about 6 or 7 minutes left before we're going to take our top of the hour break. And I'd like to basically take that particular 6 or 7 minutes and address what I see as the principal issue or significance of this whole thing. We just considered or reflected on the quality of the debates of each party this past weekend. Friday night for the Democrats, Saturday night for the Republicans. And the question I would ask you to think about is, what in the name of heaven does something called the deep state have to do with the people's the process whereby people choose the President of the United States? What occurred to me as I was reading about the deep state was the realization, in fact, that it has everything to do with our electoral process. Because it seems to me that if you accept the premise that Mike Lofgren argues in his book on the deep state, and let me give you the title of Lofgren's book because I think it's revealing. His book, which this particular piece, which appeared in Salon in January of this year, last month, is entitled The Deep State, The Fall of the Constitution and the Rise of a Shadow Government. That title, more than anything else, is what attracted me to the topic. The deep state didn't mean a whole heck of a lot to me. But the rest of the title does. The Fall of the Constitution and the Rise of a Shadow Government. Because the implication of that title is that there's a real government behind the visible government. The government all of us see, the campaign all of us are witnessing for the nominations of the major parties and the election for President of the United States, which that process will make happen this coming fall. In this particular perspective, is what we might call the visible government. It's the government that all of us see. It's the government that Madison talked about. It's the government that the Federalist Papers wrote about. It's the government explained and analyzed in the Federalist Papers. It's the government based on the principles of separation of powers and checks and balances. It's based on the party which controls Congress versus the party which controls the White House. The extent to which the Supreme Court remains apolitical, or whether in fact the Supreme Court is so divided ideologically between conservatives and liberals that it in fact has become a player in the politics of this nation. We've been experiencing and looking carefully at 5-4 decisions that the Supreme Court is reaching of late in the area of Second Amendment rights, in the areas of religious freedom, in the area of whether in fact corporations are persons and therefore entitled to Bill of Rights protections under the Constitution of the United States. We've been looking at these things here on the Virtual Center because they are so pertinent to the government. We are trying to put to the political process. We're all trying to understand and get our arms around. But what Mike Lofgren is suggesting is that this is what he might refer to as the visible government. But the real government, the one that really makes the decisions and calls the shots, is one that is functioning totally under the radar. It's what he calls in the title of his book a shadow government. It's a government most of us don't see or don't appreciate. And the fact of the matter is, Lofgren's implication, is that the shadow government is really the most important government. If that's true, if you accept that premise, then it seems to me all of us must think carefully on the electoral process that's taking place in this country, as reflected in the two political debates that many of us witnessed this past weekend. The implication here is that the debate really doesn't matter in terms of which party wins the election. Which party controls Congress? Which party controls the White House? There is the suggestion or the implication here that the public's attention is being focused on the fall elections, on the campaign for president and the campaign for control of Congress. But in reality, that's not really where the action is. That's not really where decisions are made. The government of Madison, the government created by the founders, the government that gets all the attention in our K through 12 classrooms and our higher education classrooms, according to Lofgren, is not really the government that matters. It's the shadow government, the one we don't see, that matters. Lofgren himself makes the statement toward the end of this interview with Salon. Let me find it because I think it's pretty important. In talking about the differences between the two parties, he goes back to Bill Clinton's administration, Democratic administration in the 90s, and the administration of George W. Bush in the early 21st century. If you remember the disputed 2000 election, the election with the Chads and the disputed results in Florida and all the rest of it, and the decision by Al Gore to not challenge the results of the 2000 election and challenge the decision by the Supreme Court, which 5-4 picked the President of the United States. One would naturally presume that the differences between the Democratic administrations of Bill Clinton and the Republican administration of George W. Bush would be dramatic. Lofgren's whole point is that when you really look at it, the differences are rather insignificant. There are differences, but they aren't substantive differences, because for the most part, they don't really affect the so-called shadow government that he calls the deep state. This is what Lofgren says about the differences between the two major parties. He said, if one were to compare Bush and Obama, for example, there are differences, definable differences, between Bush and Obama, Lofgren says. However, the differences are constrained. They're not the differences between the two 40-yard lines on the hypothetical football field. Rather, they are the differences between the two 48-yard lines. In other words, if you envision a football field with the 50-yard line right in the middle, and you go 10 yards one way to get to the 40-yard line, and 10 yards the other way to go to the 40-yard line, you've got 20 yards of differences, theoretically, between the two. Lofgren's argument is that when you really look at the relationship between either of these parties and the shadow government, the differences between the candidates become much less significant than the differences between the two 40-yard lines. Rather, they become much more, in synthesis or in tune with the differences between two 48-yard lines. In other words, almost insignificant. Let me share with you one quote, and then we'll pause, because we've gone beyond the top of the hour, and I apologize for that. Let me just share with you some of the text of this particular interview. The author writes, we have to only think back to Clinton. He signed a bill, and this is talking about the issue of derivatives, the cause of the depression or the recession of the early 21st century, the recession of 08-09, if you will. This goes back, the author reminds us, to the administration of Bill Clinton in the 90s, because it's Bill Clinton who signed the bill which took all the reps, all the regulations off derivatives trading. Clinton claimed later that somehow his hand was forced and that it was going to be written anyway. Lofgren says, I don't think so. Clinton ended up being paid over $100 million afterwards, mainly by corporate sponsors, to give speeches. It was kind of like compensation after the fact. Given the ubiquity, the commonality, the sense that it's everywhere, given the ubiquity and continuity of the deep state, will it matter whether the Republican or the Democrat wins the presidential race later this year? Or will it be the same either way? Lofgren says it matters to a certain extent. A competent rogue is probably preferable to an insane rogue. There are definable differences, and this is the quote I read before. There are definable differences between Bush and Obama. However, the differences are constrained. They're not between the 40-yard lines, they're between the 48-yard lines. The implication is that when it comes to an administration's relationship to the deep state, the differences that seemingly exist between the parties become rather significant. The differences become rather insignificant. We're at 7 minutes after the hour. I want to pause for a short break here, 4 or 5 minute break. When we come back, I'd like to look at exactly what this deep state is about. Because the implication is that if it exists and if it's real, then it's really where the action is. And if it's really where the action is, then it seems to me one has to wonder about the significance of what's happening with the visible government. The public's attention may be focused in the wrong place. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're at 8 minutes after the hour, 8 minutes after the hour of 2 p.m. in the East. We're going to pause for a 4 or 5 minute break, and then we'll be right back for our second hour. Thank you for joining us here at the Virtual Center. We'll be right back.
We now return to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Here again is Dr. Bill O'Brien. I thought you'd enjoy that track, Bill.
Oh, I love it, Bob.
Well, the title of it is Mardi Gras.
Uh-huh.
This is Mardi Gras. This is Mardi Gras.
This is Mardi Gras. Indeed it is. Thank you, Bob.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much. Oh, it's wonderful. Welcome to our second hour, abbreviated though it is, here at the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're in the throes, supposedly, of a winter advisory snow emergency today. Our schools have all let out, at least the ones in this immediate region. But right now the sun is streaming in our windows, but the sky is cloudy enough and dark enough that I anticipate that there'll be some results to the anticipation that caused our schools to close. Welcome to our second hour here at the Virtual Center. I do encourage your participation in the program. I thank you for being here, but I also invite you, in fact, I solicit you to participate more actively in the program than just merely listening, and that is sharing your thoughts and ideas, concerns, questions, whatever they might be, with our other listeners here at the Virtual Center. Our phone number that enables you to do that is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. My email address, if you'd like to communicate with me that way, one-on-one, waobrien906@gmail.com. That's W-A-O'Brien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906@gmail.com. And again, I do invite you to visit our Facebook page. Go to Facebook and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you will see the various postings that I've put on there over in recent weeks. The one nearest the top will be the one that I put on last evening, which covers pretty much the topic that we were covering prior to our break today, namely the existence of the deep state and the extent to which it affects or doesn't affect the results of the election campaign that is taking or drawing so much of our attention here in this nation as we sit and watch these public debates between the two major parties. We were privileged to have one of these this past Friday night and one on Saturday evening as well. The point is that what Mike Lofgren is suggesting in his book, The Deep State, is that when one considers the reality and spends time thinking about the reality of the shadow government, the so-called deep state, one must confront the reality of the fact that while there are differences between the two major parties, when it comes to their interaction with the deep state, the differences cease to be really that significant. I think this is an incredibly important phenomenon. I will share with you the reason that I think it's incredibly significant. And for that, we need to go back and look at a little bit of the emergence or the development of the American two-party system from the period of the founding into the early 19th century, which is the direction that I see programming going in our next couple of weeks, it seems to me. I want to spend time on Washington's farewell address of 1796, President Washington's message to the nation on the danger of political parties. Because I think there's a dramatic shift in the nature of political parties that exists during this period. It's evident at the time of the founding and immediately after ratification of the Constitution, in the earliest years of the nation's history, nobody was an advocate of what we call today major political parties. Most Americans were opposed to the reality of parties. But it's important to recognize that when they talked party, they were talking faction. They weren't talking about the wide open universal nature of our two-party system as exists today, as reflected in this weekend's debates between the two major parties. The two major parties are competing for majority support in the nation. Ultimately, the party that wins the White House is going to be the party that attracts the majority of the voter turnout this coming November. And in order to secure that majority vote, the parties, both of them, are traditionally required to move their agenda or their mission statements, their party platforms, as the term is used, toward the center. In other words, if the goal is a majority vote, then by definition that causes both parties to move their campaigns more toward the center. That's the issue in the Republican Party right now, between Trump and Cruz on the one hand, and the so-called coterie of governors on the other, Chris Christie, Jeb Bush, John Kasich. These are the more moderate elements within the Republican Party. These candidates who are running way behind way behind Trump and Ted Cruz at this point. The establishment leadership of the Republican Party, those who really run the party, are adamant that if Trump or Cruz is successful in getting the Republican nomination, the likelihood is that the Republican Party will suffer a devastating defeat at the polls this fall. Because both Trump and Cruz are so polarizing that while each has his own group of adamant supporters. There are so many that don't support these two that if the only alternative is to vote Democrat, then the result will be a devastating defeat for the Republican Party. And that's what the establishment within the Republican Party is trying to avoid. Behind the scenes, they've been looking for ways to short-circuit or derail the Trump campaign and most recently the Cruz campaign. They really have desperately been hoping that one of the governors, whether it's Kasich, whether it's Christie, whether it's Bush, one of these moderates begins to pick up steam and move into the upper echelon of candidates with the best chance to secure the nomination. The Republicans believe they have a good chance against Hillary. They're still operating on the assumption that Hillary will be the Democratic candidate. Their assumption is that their best chance to defeat Hillary is when one of these moderate, middle-of-the-road like candidates. As of this weekend, it appeared that Marco Rubio might be that candidate. He's clearly not a moderate. He's clearly not middle of the road. On issues like abortion and immigration, there are areas of Rubio's agenda that frighten the establishment. On the immigration issue, for example, Rubio was one of the people that worked with Senator Schumer, the Democrat from New York, on some sort of moderate, middle-of-the-road solution to the immigration problem. But when it became politically uncomfortable for him to be there, Rubio backed away. He did not basically draw the line and lay out his support for the moderate position because he knew that if he did that, he wouldn't have a chance of securing support within the Republican Party. The support of the more conservative right-wing aspect of the Republican Party. And that's one of the issues that Chris Christie got him on this weekend by suggesting that when the things got tough, Rubio backed off. Hardly the kind of leadership qualities we're looking for in a president, Christie's point seemed to be. But going into this weekend's Republican debate, coming out of Iowa, it looked like Rubio might be the knight in shining armor on the white horse that was going to save the Republican Party's bacon, if you will, in this fall elections. Namely, he would be the moderate, middle centrist kind of candidate that could pull the party together and would stand the chance of beating Hillary at the expense, of course, of both Trump and Cruz. But Rubio experienced a beating Saturday night. For those of you who watched it, you know what I mean, especially at the hands of Chris Christie. He didn't do too well. He fumbled, he got flustered, he looked to be in trouble. Because increasingly, Christie's challenge or argument that Rubio was for the most part scripted and that his campaign was not genuine and that he was not up to being president seemed to grab hold. And so now the establishment is back waiting for the results of New Hampshire tomorrow in order to determine whether one of these more moderate candidates will move up quickly or whether, in fact, Rubio will stay there. The point is that by definition, our political parties, as they currently function in our electoral system, are designed to promote compromise, designed to promote negotiation and deliberation on issues. Elections are won by aiming your campaign toward the center, not the extreme left or the extreme right. The transition to that reality of our current two-party system is the development process that I've been talking about, trying to cover here at the Virtual Center. And that's the issue that we will cover as we go on. The difference between parties as factions, which was the assumption made during the time of the founding, and the nature of our modern two-party systems is substantially different. In fact, Richard Hofstadter, in his book, The Idea of a Party System, Richard Hofstadter's idea is the idea of two universal middle-of-the-road parties which attract the bulk of people from different perspectives on different issues is a revolutionary concept. It's not an easy one to get your arms around. It's so different than the idea of parties as factions, as united interest groups standing all for the same thing. And the development process that I'd like to cover here at the Virtual Center is the process of transition from party as faction to the emergence of our modern party system, which puts the focus, the emphasis on elections, on campaigns, on voting, on PR, on political education of the electorate. All of these things which bring the masses of our population into the political process. At the time of the founding, many of our citizens were excluded from the political process, whether it be because of race, whether it be because of gender. I mean, only white males could vote, or whether it be because of wealth, being able to meet property qualifications. There were so many things in the political reality of the early years of the nation's history that left people out of the political process, that the phenomenon we currently know about when we think of two parties was not even on the horizon. But a series of changes and happenings took place which changed that. And I'd like to spend some time addressing some of those elements of change, because I think it's a phenomenally different one. We know that with ratification of the Constitution, the idea of Republican government as it existed at the time of independence and during the Confederation period changed drastically. We know that most Americans believed that in order for a republic to be successful, it had to be small. Madison's challenge was to preserve the elements of Republican government, but at the same time incorporate those Republican elements into the new Constitution, into the new nation state that emerged out of ratification of the Constitution. In order to make republicanism still fit, still apply, the substance and meaning of republicanism had to change. And a significant element within Federalist Number 10 is Madison's explanation of that change. How the idea of Republican government, where power was potentially in the hands of the people, and the representative was envisioned as the agent of the constituency, shifted to the point that the representative, the elected representative, became the decision maker rather than the agent of the voters. The shift was significant. We covered that. some months ago here at the Virtual Center. But the fact of the matter is that's only the beginning of the kinds of political changes that occurred in the nation's early history in order to create the transition from parties as Madison, Washington, and Hamilton understood them at the time of ratification into the nature of our party system as we know it today. What we have today is a party system, a political system built around the model of including everybody and excluding nobody. That's the model. The model is that a Republican government in today's thinking is one which must be totally inclusive, totally participatory. The ideal behavior of the ideal citizen in a republic is to participate, is to become a voter, is to become actively involved in political campaigns, is to become the supporter of one or the other of the political candidates. If you think about it, our two-party system as it exists today is a system which can make room for everybody to become active. It builds a sense of camaraderie within the nation, within the citizenry. It is a mechanism which overcomes differences between people and instead brings them together, causes them to deliberate their differences, to negotiate their differences, and to reach new elements or places of agreement. It is a phenomenally unique, creative, perceptive system, and it works. But the fact of the matter is, what we've been looking at in today's program here at the Virtual Center, the idea of the deep state, is the kind of shadow government that doesn't become actively involved in this process at all. What we're seeing is voters, parties, campaigns being focused on the visible government. But the shadow government that Lofgren is talking about is one which very few of our citizens even is aware of, let alone can affect at all. In 2014, a year before his book, The Deep State, came out, Lofgren wrote an essay on the idea of the deep state. It's published online at the website of Bill Moyers and Company. It's the prelude to Lofgren's book on the deep state. Let me share with you some of the relevant aspects of Lofgren's explanation of what he means by the deep state. At the beginning of his essay, he says the following, and this we've pretty much covered, so this ought to be fairly familiar. There is, Lofgren says, the visible government situated around the mall in Washington. And then there's an other, more shadowy, more indefinable government that is not explained in Civics 101, or that is not observable to tourists at the White House or at the Capitol. The visible government is traditional Washington partisan politics. The tip of the iceberg that a public watching C-SPAN sees daily and which is theoretically controllable via elections. The subsurface part of the iceberg, the part of the iceberg that we never see, is what Lofgren calls the deep state. It operates according to its own compass, irrespective of who is formally in power. This is a government that operates independently of what the people say in their elections, in their votes. Lofgren explains, and I think he does it better than I can, so let me rely on him. He says, during the last 5 years, the news media has been flooded with pundits decrying the broken politics in Washington. The conventional wisdom has it that partisan gridlock and dysfunction have become the new normal. This is certainly the case. And Lofgren himself says, I've been among the harshest critic of Washington dysfunction. But it's also important to acknowledge the limits of this critique as it applies to American government. On one level, the critique is self-evident. In the domain that the public can see, Congress is hopefully deadlocked in the worst manner since the 1850s, the violent decade that preceded the Civil War. Yet, Lofgren says, there's another government, concealed behind the one that is visible at either end of Pennsylvania Avenue, a hybrid entity of public and private institutions ruling the country. It's this shadow government, the government behind the government, that runs the country, Lofgren is saying. In his book, The Party is Over, Lofgren identified what he said was the principal objective of congressional Republicans, which was to render the executive branch powerless, to render President Obama powerless, at least until a Republican president is elected. President Obama cannot enact his domestic policies or his budgets. Because of incessant GOP filibustering, not only can he not fill the large number of vacancies in the federal judiciary, he can't even find his most innocuous presidential appointees getting into office. Republicans refuse to fill the appointments that the president depends on to run his administration. In other words, what we have at present in Washington is what Lofgren calls congressional nullification of executive branch power. Congress has brought government to a standstill. At least that's what it appears we are facing. Lofgren goes on and explains that in reality, this dysfunction might not be the biggest part of the story. Despite this apparent impotence, Lofgren says, President Obama can liquidate American citizens without due process. In other words, he can send out the word that leaders of ISIS or Al-Qaeda or whatever that need to be eliminated can be eliminated by drones and all the rest of it. President Obama then can liquidate American citizens without due process. He can detain prisoners indefinitely without charge, Guantanamo. Conduct dragnet surveillance on the American people without judicial warrant, and engage in unprecedented, at least since the McCarthy era, witch hunts against federal employees, the so-called insider threat program, Snowden. Within the United States, this power that Obama has as president is characterized by massive displays of intimidating force by militarized federal, state, and local law enforcement. Abroad, President Obama can start wars at will. He can engage in virtually any activity whatsoever without so much as attending Congress at all, such as arranging forced landing of a plane carrying a sovereign head of state over a foreign country. Despite the Republicans' complaint about executive overreach by President Obama, whom they call a would-be dictator, we've heard almost nothing from the Republicans, from the Republican-controlled Congress, about any of these other actions. Democrats also rarely utter a word about some of these actions. In other words, one part of the government, the part that we see, seems to be impotent and dysfunctional. But on the other hand, foreign policy, military policy, the war on terror continues to operate. It's almost as if you use the word terrorism, everybody jumps in line, jumps on board, and you can do whatever you want to do. An example, and I don't remember the specific details in terms of time and everything, but here's an example of what Lofgren is talking about in his article. In 2011, during the time when the nation was enmeshed in political warfare over the debt ceiling and beginning to paralyze governance in Washington, at exactly the time when the debate in Washington was about shutting down government over the debt ceiling, at exactly that time, the United States government somehow got together the resources to overthrow Gaddafi in Libya. And when the instability of Libya spilled over into Mali, the administration found a way to conduct overt and covert assistance to France and France's determination to intervene in Mali. At the time when everybody was screaming in Washington about budget crisis, somehow our government, and I'm reading directly from Lofgren's article, our government somehow was able to commit $115 million to keeping a civil war going in Syria, and was able to pay $100 million pounds to the United Kingdom's government communications headquarters to buy influence over that country's intelligence. Since 2007, we know that 2 major bridges carrying interstate highways have collapsed, which speaks to the need for attention to our infrastructure that so threatens the nation. At the very same time that our infrastructure was found to be woefully deficient, that bridges were collapsing, government spent $1.7 billion constructing a building in Utah for the National Security Agency to store information. And as part of that information storage, the NSA came up with a new term called yottabyte, a yottabyte of information, the largest numerical designator computer scientists have ever coined. A yottabyte is equal to 500 quintillion pages of text. During the height of bridge collapse, when there was no money in this country to build anything, the government built a $1.7 billion facility in Utah to store this information gathering. How did that happen? If government is impotent, if government is dysfunctional. That's the issue that Lofgren is talking about. His conclusion: there is another government concealed behind the one that is visible at either end of Pennsylvania Avenue. It's connected to, but only irregularly controlled by the visible state whose leaders we choose. It's not secret. It's a shadow government, but it's not secret. It's not hidden. He said it's out there in plain sight. He says, quote, "The institution is not so much sinister, although it has highly sinister aspects, as it is relentlessly well entrenched. Far from being invincible, its failures, such as those in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, are routine enough that it is only the deep state's protectiveness towards its higher-ranking personnel that allows them to escape the consequences of their frequent ineptitude." Lofgren's position is that this government continues to function because within the government that we see is a rather shadow, nearly invisible aspect of that government, which is on the same page, which functions according to a sense of ideological agreement and commitment, which is not that visible, which is overwhelmed by the differences that we've emphasized between our party. In other words, the more we emphasize the visible government and the differences between liberals and conservatives, the more our political process is shielding the degree of consensus and agreement within the so-called shadow government that Lofgren calls the deep state. He talks about the issue of groupthink. We've talked about that. That there is in bureaucracy, in all bureaucracies, something that the psychologists call groupthink. That people in the same bureaucratic business tend eventually to think the same way. They tend to agree on the same things. They need to look for the same things. And they look for verification of what they believe by focusing on the same kinds of evidence. Lofgren quotes Upton Sinclair, the famous muckraker of the late 19th, early 20th century. Upton Sinclair's book, if you remember from your history classes, revealed the filth and the crime associated in the meatpacking industry in the late 19th century. And out of this, in the administration of President Theodore Roosevelt, was the Meat Inspection Act of 1906, which came out of the public horror created in the nation over the disease and the filth in America's meatpacking industry. And it was because of Upton Sinclair's research as a muckraker that particular industry was made public and the problems within it revealed. Upton Sinclair, Lofgren said the following: "It's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it," unquote. In other words, the people in bureaucracy, the people who are part of the system, so to speak, get paid not only because of their skills and abilities, but they get paid for seeing and believing in certain things and not seeing other things. And over time, they tend to overlook more and more. And that's part of what the psychologists call groupthink. This is the public, according to Lofgren, this is the makeup of the deep state, at least the public agency part of the deep state. Let me share Lofgren's paragraph. The deep state, he says, does not consist of the entire government. It's a hybrid of national security and law enforcement agencies. The Department of Defense, the Department of State, the Department of Homeland Security, the CIA, the Justice Department. Lofgren said, "I also include the Department of the Treasury because it has jurisdiction over financial flows, its enforcement of international sanctions, and its organic symbiosis with Wall Street." The Department of the Treasury operates on the same page in many ways as does Wall Street. They have more in common than they have differences between them. So what Lofgren is pointing out, if you go through all of these public agencies, Homeland Security, CIA, Department of Defense, Department of State, Justice Department, and the Department of Treasury, even certain areas of the judiciary belong to what he calls the deep state, such as FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, that the judiciary allows to function. Also included, Lofgren says, are a handful of vital federal trial courts, such as the Eastern District of Virginia, the Southern District of Manhattan, where sensitive proceedings in national security cases are conducted. The final government component, and possibly last in precedence among formal branches of government established by the Constitution, is a kind of rump Congress consisting of the congressional leadership and some, but not all, of the members of the Defense and Intelligence Committees in Congress. The rest of Congress, normally so partisan, is mostly only intermittently aware of the deep state, and when required, usually submits to a few well-chosen words from its emissaries. In other words, there were certain key members of Congress who were on the key committees, the Intelligence Committee, the Foreign Affairs Committee. These are the ones who are part of the inner circle. These are the ones who know. The vast majority of Congress don't know. Basically, what then he's talking about is that within government, it's all visible, are key individuals within key departments and key agencies, including Congress and its major committees, that are on the inside, that know what's going on, These are the people that the media tried to get and ask their opinions on the nightly news when foreign policy issues or economic issues become extremely prominent. I'm thinking of the senator from California, Dianne Feinstein. Most of the time, you never hear of Dianne Feinstein. But when it comes to major foreign policy issues, major international issues, she's there. She's on the inside. She's one of the people who know. This is the public agency side of the deep state, according to Lofgren. These are the people who are visible. But there's also a private side. And for the most part, the private side refers specifically to Wall Street. And then there's a third piece of the deep state, and it's Silicon Valley. It's Google and Apple and Microsoft. It's Bill Gates. It's the people whose wealth and influence and power over information is so critical to what the deep state has to know and be able to do. If the NSA needs information on people in order to fight terrorism, it's Silicon Valley they have to rely on for access to that information. All of this, Lofgren claims, is part of what he calls the deep state, the shadow government that really makes the decision, irrespective of which party controls the White House, which party controls Congress. Because the fact of the matter is, the leadership of both parties is in the inner circle of those who comprise the deep state. And it raises serious questions about the extent to which our republic and the accountability to our citizens that we look for and take for granted in government even exists. I think this is incredibly important. I encourage you, we'll be back to this again tomorrow. I encourage you in the interim to go online, look up the deep state, look for the essay written by Mike Lofgren, on the Bill Moyers website. There's quite a bit of information in it. That article has been, became his book, which was just published in 2015. The essay was written in 2014. It's phenomenally important. We're at 59 minutes after the hour. We've reached the end of our day today. I want to thank you for your continued support of the Virtual Center and of the Head On Radio Network. I invite you to join us again tomorrow. We'll be continuing this discussion of the deep state. I remind you that our program tomorrow will begin 1/2 hour later